How much are you willing to sacrifice for love in your youth? By then, I give everything. The courage of youth is sweeter than honey. The freshmen of that year were sorted into an advanced class, recruited with high scores through an independent selection process and given special attention. And that summer for Sophie Green and Daniel Rice was the beginning of everything. The students in the advanced class are all exceptional. I can understand why it'd be easier for you to develop feelings for each other. The homeroom teacher had said this during the entrance orientation. And as it turned out, those words applied perfectly to them. The Chinese teacher was an older woman, affectionately nicknamed Miss Smith by the students. The tricky thing about Chinese as a subject was that it relied heavily on foundational knowledge. It was often more efficient to selectively pay attention rather than listen to every word. Since both of them had a solid grasp of Chinese, whenever the lesson turned to literature analysis, they would, as if by some unspoken agreement, pull out worksheets from other subjects to work on instead. The difference was, Daniel always took out a physics worksheet, while Sophie worked on political science. As the bell rang, Daniel glanced out the window at their approaching Chinese teacher and casually asked, "What was she planning to cover today?" "Kafka," Sophie replied with a knowing smile, and the two of them simultaneously reached into their desks for their respective worksheets. Just as Miss Smith settled at the podium, Sophie stole a quick glance at Daniel out of the corner of her eye. He had already completed two multiple-choice questions, and was now sketching a force analysis diagram for the third. She was just about to focus on her political science worksheet when Miss Smith's voice rang out. "It's been a while since we had a quiz. Let's do a dictation." A murmur of surprise rippled through the class, prompting her to add, "I know this class has a particular attitude toward Chinese, but that doesn't mean I approve of it. An advanced class should uphold advanced standards. If you make mistakes, come see me in my office." At that, Daniel finally looked up. But he didn't look at Miss Smith, his gaze went straight to Sophie. "You memorized it, right?" "You have such high expectations of me," Sophie groaned, covering her face apologetically. He understood instantly. Unlike the others scrambling in panic, he remained perfectly composed. While Sophie frantically flipped through her textbook to skim the dictation material at lightning speed, Daniel reached into his cabinet, retrieved a condensed summary sheet for dictation, and discreetly placed it between their desks, holding it down with his elbow. "There's too much, you won't finish reading it in time," he remarked, shifting his attention to the class as they passed around the quiz papers, his demeanor so natural that Sophie had to admire him. The psychological gap between men and women was truly something. This guy was calmly preparing to cheat like nothing was happening. "Are you a repeat offender?" Sophie teased in a whisper as she accepted the paper passed down from the front. "Nope, first time," he replied, though the faint smile at the corner of his lips betrayed him. Then, as he lowered his gaze to focus on the quiz, the smile gradually disappeared. In the end, despite placing the summary sheet between them as a safety net, neither of them actually looked at it. As they wrote, they realized they could recall the material on their own. That sheet in the middle seemed to serve no real purpose, just a precaution in case either of them blanked out. As Sophie neared the end of her dictation, she instinctively glanced up, only to find Miss Smith unexpectedly stepping down from the podium, strolling around to inspect everyone's work. She was getting closer, only 2 or 3 desks away. Since they had never done anything like this before, Sophie's heart pounded. Panicking, she nudged Daniel's elbow with her own, signaling him to hide the paper. She couldn't say anything aloud, so all she could do was pray that he'd understand immediately and act quickly. But this guy, his nerves were way too strong. After she nudged him, not only did he not hide it, he even moved his elbow slightly away. Sophie nearly had a heart attack. Daniel must have thought Miss Smith wouldn't be able to see it clearly. Just as she was about to snatch the summary sheet and shove it into her drawer, Miss Smith arrived at their desks. She looked down at them, or rather at the cheat sheet between them. Perhaps it was only a brief and ordinary silence, but to Sophie, caught in the midst of panic, it felt unbearably long. She had no idea what to do, or what kind of punishment awaited them. The only thing she could do was sit there, forcing herself to act as if nothing had happened, head down, pretending not to notice a thing. But that sheet of paper remained there the entire time, never actually put to use. The next moment, Miss Smith rapped her knuckles against Sophie Green's desk. "Come see me after class." Sophie's mind went completely blank. She said nothing, though the panic on her face was unmistakable. Daniel Rice looked equally surprised. He lifted his head, boldly beginning, "Teach clearly." He was about to take responsibility. To say that it wasn't just Sophie's fault. He didn't have to say it. Sophie already knew what he intended to do. Summoning courage from who knows where, she cut him off. "Okay, teacher." He stared at her, momentarily stunned. She, however, couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. The rest of the lesson passed in agonizing silence for her. On one hand, she didn't want to make Daniel feel guilty. On the other, she tried her best to appear relaxed, completely unaware that Daniel himself had abandoned his physics worksheet altogether. Instead, his gaze lingered on her fingers, which were absent-mindedly rubbing the face of her watch. She must be really nervous, he thought. From time to time, he glanced at her through the corner of his eye, watching her feign composure. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know what. Maybe for Sophie's sake, it was better for him to stay calm. As soon as the bell rang, Miss Smith glanced over, a silent reminder for Sophie to come outside. Sophie got up and walked to the hallway, standing before the teacher with her head slightly lowered. What she didn't expect was that, suddenly, a boy rushed up beside her and stopped in his tracks, calling out, "Teacher." The moment was almost surreal. She turned to him in surprise. In that brief exchange of glances, her eyes seemed to ask, "What are you doing here?" His, however, answered calmly, "Why wouldn't I be here?" Despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her, Sophie found that his presence unexpectedly steadied her nerves. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" Miss Smith asked, slightly taken aback by his sudden arrival. Both of them knew the truth, though the sheet of paper had been slightly closer to Sophie. It had been placed between them. Miss Smith had chosen to single her out, perhaps because she was more lenient toward the boy whom many teachers praised as exceptionally gifted. "That sheet was mine," Daniel said, his voice unwavering. "I put it there. I was the only one planning to cheat because I didn't study last night." It was a lie, spoken so naturally that even Sophie was momentarily stunned. Miss Smith was clearly surprised. Someone as sharp as Daniel Rice had to know why she hadn't called him out earlier. His unexpected honesty put her in a difficult position. A brief silence followed. Then, the warning bell for the next class rang, breaking the tense moment. Miss Smith sighed and looked at the two of them. "All right, tonight, both of you will copy the entire text 10 times and submit it tomorrow. If this happens again, it won't be this simple." Daniel grinned. "Understood." As Miss Smith turned to leave, he nudged Sophie's shoulder lightly. "Let's go, class is starting." 10 times didn't sound like much, but it took quite a bit of time. They spent half of the evening study session writing. When Daniel finally finished, he let out a breath and leaned back against his chair. Seeing that Sophie was still behind, he reached for her notebook. "Here, let me show you what efficiency looks like." Grabbing two pens, he started copying for her. Before long, he had finished her remaining pages. When he handed the notebook back, he smirked. "Pretty impressive, huh?" She glanced at it and couldn't help but laugh. "Aside from the handwriting, it's not bad." Thick-skinned as ever, Daniel ignored the first part and beamed. "All right, I'll take that as a compliment. I won't argue with you." Sophie chuckled and pulled out her math workbook, ready to start on her assignments, only to notice that Daniel hadn't moved. He was still watching her. She found it amusing. "What are you staring at?" "Just thinking," he murmured, a deep amusement in his gaze. He lowered his voice so only the two of them could hear. "The class division results come out next week. If you get into the humanities advanced class, I'll treat you to a meal." "Huh? Come on, we're desk mates, we should stick together," he said with a grin, already making the decision for them. It's settled. Later, as she worked through her math problems, she kept getting distracted. Her thoughts kept circling back to what he had said. How if she got into the humanities class? He'd take her out for a meal. Back when they had to choose between the science and humanities track, she had already felt reluctant, but their academic strengths were too obvious. She wasn't competitive enough for science, and he would be wasting his natural talent in a humanities class. Still, everything felt just right as it was now. More than anything, she wanted to stay seatmates with Daniel Rice. Some connections between people are just that way when something feels so comfortable. You don't want to let go. And thinking about his words just now, she suddenly felt very warm inside. After the evening's self-study session ended, Daniel Rice quickly packed his bag. On his way out, he playfully rolled up a worksheet and tapped it against Sophie Green's head. "I'm heading out. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow." For some reason, her face felt inexplicably warm. She lowered her head, busying herself with packing her things, assuming that Daniel hadn't noticed. But he had. The boy, secretly delighted, walked briskly out of the classroom and intercepted his friend Kevin in the hallway, pulling him to a quieter corner. "Got a question for you. Where's a good place to take a girl out for dinner?" "You asked Sophie Green out." Kevin couldn't hide his surprise. "Of course." Daniel admitted it outright, making no attempt to conceal the proud gleam in his eyes. "Hot pot, obviously. I'll ask my dad to reserve you a table. No need to wait in line." Kevin chuckled but remained curious. "But seriously, how did you ask her?" I just told her that if she got into the humanities advanced class, I'd take her out for a meal. Oh? She's definitely getting in. Ha ha ha, man. I'm actually looking forward to this now. Can't believe I'm witnessing the day Daniel Rice asks a girl out. This is a historic moment. Kevin glanced over and caught sight of Sophie Green entering the classroom. Instantly, he got the message and started teasing, oh. Before he could say more, Daniel shoved him away. The class division results were released on the last day of the semester. That day also happened to be the final match of the school-wide basketball tournament. Initially, it was supposed to be the last game, but a previous one had been cancelled due to rain. Everyone joked that if it rained again, they might never get another chance to play together, especially since they'd all be in different classes next semester. Daniel arrived at school early that day. The first thing he did was check the class assignment results. Seeing Sophie Green's name on the humanities advanced list and ranked near the top, he immediately felt relieved. Sitting at his desk, waiting for her to arrive, he couldn't stop smiling. The moment she walked into the classroom, before she even had the chance to check the results, he announced, "All right, looks like I owe you dinner tonight." Then he quickly added, "Also, there's a basketball game today. You should come watch and wait for me there." She looked at the brightness in his eyes as he spoke. Finding it amusing, she let out an "oh," and then ran up to the front of the classroom to check the list. She was embarrassed. He knew it, and that made him smile even more. Standing there, Sophie Green scanned the names. His name was first on the science advanced list. A sense of relief washed over her. Just last night, she had felt an odd sense of detachment, realizing that today would be their last day in the same class. From tomorrow onwards, they might never be this close again. But now, seeing both of their names neatly placed under the humanities and science lists respectively, she felt strangely at peace. At least they were where they were meant to be. It was the right choice for both of them. She genuinely wished the best for him, and she could feel it. He felt the same about her. The basketball court was crowded. Among the spectators, she only had eyes for him. She thought Daniel Rice wouldn't be able to spot her in the crowd. Yet right after he scored a basket, his gaze landed on her with pinpoint accuracy, and he shot her a cocky smile. She hadn't expected that, but somehow, he made her smile too. Kevin, noticing the exchange, bumped Daniel's shoulder. "Man, the stench of young love is overwhelming." Daniel said nothing, but his grin deepened. Sophie, feeling inexplicably flustered, quickly looked away. It wasn't until after he won the game and took her to the hot pot restaurant that Sophie fully realized she was actually out alone with Daniel Rice. As he dipped ingredients into the spicy broth, he casually teased, "Eat more. You know, for brain nourishment." Sophie looked at the piece of food he had just dropped into the bubbling red oil, confused. "What is that?" "Something good." He smirked. After a moment, he finally revealed pig brain. "Daniel, get lost." Her face turned scarlet. All right, I'll stop." He chuckled, watching her expression soften. Then, after a brief pause, he sighed. "You know, I didn't expect to feel this reluctant about the class split." Sophie Green looked into his bright, sincere eyes. She didn't know where she found the courage, but she admitted, "Actually, I feel the same way." In a class ranked by academic performance, where competition was intense, most people got along, but genuine friendships were rare. Daniel Rice was probably one of the few people who had always been open and sincere with her. She just hadn't expected that he felt the same way. Daniel scooped the pig brain out of the pot and placed it into her bowl. Then he paused, staring at her intently as if searching for something, or perhaps as if trying to muster the last bit of courage. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and in that moment, she found herself unable to look away, caught in the depths of his gaze, like being pulled into an inescapable whirlpool. Could the emotion swirling in those eyes be called love? Daniel cleared his throat, his voice calm yet carrying an unusual hint of hesitation. "You know, there was a selfish reason I always helped you with science." She didn't speak, but she sensed something. She waited, looking at him, urging him to continue. "At the time, I saw how much better you were at humanities and sciences and thought, damn, she's definitely going to choose humanities." He sighed. "So I started tutoring you in science every day during lunch. Figured that if your scores improved enough, maybe, just maybe, I could convince you to choose science instead. But in the end, I failed. Science is still your weakness. Honestly, don't you think you should eat some pig brain?" With that, he tapped her bowl lightly with a spoon. Sophie Green blushed, but she still asked, "Why were you trying so hard to get me into science?" When he first asked her out, she had already felt a vague sense of something. Now that they had come this far, she wanted to hear it for real. Because the truth was, she also didn't want to be apart from him. She wanted to be closer. "To keep you as my seatmate." His voice was clear, unwavering. His eyes, even brighter. To keep you by my side. To be with you. He smiled. That kind of being with you, the kind where I like you, Sophie. I really like you. Under a steady gaze, hearing words she had never expected him to say, Sophie's mind went completely blank. After a long pause, she finally spoke. I think I like you too. She had always loved people's eyes because eyes never lied. And no matter how exhausted Daniel Rice sometimes looked, his eyes were always bright whenever he saw her. She thought perhaps in his eyes she was the same, because in her heart those feelings were there too. Kevin's father's hot pot restaurant was packed with people. Daniel Rice had always been a rational person, but at this moment his heartbeat raced. An uncontrollable joy spread through him. After all, what could be better than knowing the person you like likes you back? He reached out and held Sophie's hand on the table. Her fingers were slender and soft. He had probably brushed against them before, but today was the first time he truly held them. Her face was red, partly from the heat of the hot pot, partly from the warmth of the moment. She liked this version of Daniel Rice, the boy who was rational to the world, but sentimental in front of her. This moment she would remember for a lifetime. During the summer break, they secretly met up a few times. Each time, it was either the library or a walk by the river, ordinary things that, because of each other, felt unbelievably sweet. After the class division in their second year, the humanities and science advanced classes were separated by an entire floor. Yet every morning, Daniel Rice would wait for her by the staircase, even if it meant standing there for 10 minutes just to see her for two. That brief encounter alone was enough to make the day feel full of motivation. After the split, Daniel Rice remained at the top of the science class, while Sophie Green, no longer held back by the burdens of science subjects, consistently ranked in the top 3 of the humanities class. Of course, a big reason for this was that Daniel continued accompanying her to the library on weekends, for study sessions, always helping her with math. Everything happened without their teachers or parents knowing, yet it all unfolded so naturally, like a mountain spring, pure with just a faint hint of sweetness. The unfinished basketball match from their first year was never played again. Everyone gradually adapted to their new environments. Some people faded into the background of memory, yet Daniel remained the same. Still that boy who sincerely liked her. One day, while waiting for her at the stairwell corner, where there were no security cameras, he blurted out his first words the moment they met. I checked. Your class doesn't have any good-looking guys. There was unmistakable pride in his voice. There aren't many boys in the humanities class to begin with. She rolled her eyes. But still, for some inexplicable reason, she felt a little happy. Always unknowingly feeling happy just because the other person was happy. That was probably one of the side effects of liking someone. High school life passed by quickly, filled with studies, flowing like a quiet, steady spring, constant and unrelenting. As the college entrance exam Gaokao approached, some students had already secured early admission offers, while others either prepared for the national exam or set their sights on studying abroad. Plans for the future were already silently being put into place. Before the evening self-study session, Daniel Rice sat with Sophie Green in an inconspicuous corner of the cafeteria. Noticing that she looked exhausted, he couldn't help but ask, "What's wrong?" She glanced up at him, and in that split second, a wave of emotion surged through her. She almost teared up, quickly lowering her head to stare at her meal, just feeling a lot of pressure. With him, she could be her true self. Pressure wasn't something she could tell teachers or parents about. She couldn't even talk to classmates who were struggling just as hard. She wanted to be as outstanding as him, but she felt like she had hit a wall. Like no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break through. And now, without her saying a word, he had sensed it. And he was gently, quietly, concerned for her. She spoke softly. I know. You didn't apply for early admission or take the direct admission exams. You insisted on taking the Gaokao because of me. I'm really touched, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. But I also truly want you to do even better. I want to be as excellent as you. But sometimes I feel like no matter how hard I try, I can't keep up. I feel guilty. I'm afraid of disappointing you. As she spoke, her tears finally fell, no longer something she could hold back. Adolescent emotions were simple and fragile, and the deepest grievances could only be shown to the person she liked most. What she said, he had worried about that long ago. Even though Sophie had always ranked among the top 3 in humanities, the reality was that, under the country's science-focused policies and the school's preferential support, for STEM students, it would be difficult for her to get into the same university as him. Daniel chuckled, ruffling her hair lightly. Even if I take the Gaokao normally, I'll still do well. You should trust me on that. You just need to study well and stay in a good mindset. You're great at humanities, math, and English. Plus, you've got me helping you with math. Why wouldn't we be able to go to the same school? And besides, Sophie, even if we don't end up at the same university, I won't let go of you." His voice was quiet, meant only for the two of them, yet it carried a certainty that made her heart settle. He reached out and wiped away her tears. "All right, eat up." She nodded furiously, lowering her head to eat. He, however, stopped eating. Instead, he just looked at her, thinking about the future. The night they checked their Gaokao results, Daniel Rice called her and talked for the entire night. The air was warm and humid with the summer breeze. After their parents had gone to bed, they stood on their respective balconies, whispering into their phones. "Sophie, it's okay." Before calling, he had hesitated for a long time, imagining all the emotions and reactions she might have. He was afraid she might feel so disappointed about the future that she'd decide to let go of him. "I know." Her voice was calm, but there was a faint trace of disappointment. "Promise me, fill out your college applications properly. Don't even think about retaking the exam." His voice was steady, firm, as if trying to tell her everything he wanted her to know. He had scored exceptionally well, enough to go to Fudan, the university he had always aimed for. But Sophie could only make it into Sun Yat-sen University. Both were good schools, but she had always been determined to follow him, to stay as close to him as possible. "I have something to tell you," she said. "And don't try to change my mind, I've already decided." Daniel said, "Between Fudan and Sun Yat-sen, I think Sun Yat-sen suits me better. It's closer to you, closer to my family. It's perfect. Don't do this." Her voice was filled with urgency. She was terrified that he would really choose Sun Yat-sen just for her. If he had truly wanted to go there, then why had he worked so hard to stay at the top of the science class for 3 years? Even for someone as naturally talented as him, staying number one had required immense effort. The results he had achieved should match the hard work he had put in. "This is my own decision. It has nothing to do with you, Sophie. You said you'd always support me." Daniel, her tears fell silently. She buried her face in her arms, resting on the railing, feeling both touched and reluctant. It felt like she had somehow changed the course of his future, all because she wasn't good enough. The night was quiet. On the other end of the call, there was silence for a moment, then Daniel suddenly laughed, just like he always did. "So, that means you can never abandon me in the future." "How could I ever abandon you?" she choked out, finally breaking into sobs. But as she listened to his endless chatter from the other end of the line, she suddenly smiled, crying and laughing at the same time. Listening to his voice, she realized this summer was unlike any other summer before, just as he had expected. Both the homeroom teacher and the academic director repeatedly contacted him, and his parents upon learning that he had chosen Sun Yat-sen University over Fudan. They urged him not to make an impulsive decision. Somehow, they had also found out about his relationship with Sophie Green, and he admitted it without hesitation. They were together. "Giving up your future for love is an irrational choice, Daniel. When you're 30, you'll look back and regret it. As teachers, we only want what's best for you. You can still have a bright future at Sun Yat-sen," he replied with a smile, calm and unwavering, as if nothing in the world could change his mind. Daniel Rice. The persuasion continued, not just from teachers, but also from relatives and family friends who had only recently learned of his decision. To most people, love at this age was nothing more than a fleeting, youthful sentiment, not something worth sacrificing a golden opportunity for. But in the end, he still chose Sun Yat-sen, and when the acceptance letters arrived, he felt nothing but joy knowing that they held the same one in their hands. That day, the school called them back to take a commemorative photo with the faculty, the top students of the humanities and science classes standing side by side. In the picture, she smiled shyly, while his expression remained as confident and bright as ever. Later, this photo was printed in the school's promotional materials, placed alongside past graduates. Every year, when they returned for the school anniversary, they would see their younger selves displayed in the alumni section. Teachers were always happy to see them doing well. Yet, among those who knew the story, there were always a few who couldn't help but sigh. Two outsiders. It seemed as though Daniel had thrown away an incredible opportunity for a decision he might one day regret. But only Daniel understood just how much it was worth. He wanted to hold Sophie's hand tightly, to make sure that every promise of companionship was not just empty words. He wanted to be with her forever. And if the person making the choice believed it was worth it, what was there to regret? As time passed, teachers continued to guide new generations of students, and every year when they met a new advanced class, they would say the same thing. "I know that in a class like this, where everyone is exceptional, it's easier to develop feelings for one another." You had a senior once, a teacher would say, speaking lightly, almost offhandedly. He chose Sun Yat-sen over Fuden, just because a senior girl was going there. Among the murmurs of students reacting to the story, the teachers would sigh, but not with the same urgency they had back then when trying to dissuade him from his choice. Now, it was just a neutral statement. In the end, it's about knowing what you're willing to give up. But at the very least, only those with choices can make sacrifices. This wouldn't be the last time such a thing happened. In the years to come, there would be others. Other boys who would make the same choice. Other love stories just as brave and steadfast. Because of this age, this kind of love was the most fearless and the most certain.